The breath clung to the air, thick with the scent of damp earth and the promise of something terrible. 3 days. That's all it took for a single, impossible act of mercy to uncoil the very fabric of their world, setting the stage for a confrontation that would either forge a new path or shatter everything they knew. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. Ilara had known solitude intimately, a quiet pact forged in the crucible of past mistakes she never spoke of. Her cabin, a rough-hewn testament to perseverance, sat nestled on the periphery of the known world, where the civilized frontier bled into the wild, untamed expanse. The Quicksand pit, a malevolent scar on the landscape, was a landmark she usually skirted wide, its murky depths a whispered warning against arrogance. Yet, that morning, a primal cry had drawn her, a sound that ripped through the otherwise placid morning, pulling her like a fish to a barbed hook. It was a guttural, desperate plea for air, for life, tearing at the silence that was her constant companion. She moved through the dew-kissed tall grasses, her heart hammering against her ribs, a drumbeat of dread. What she saw stopped her cold. A boy, no older than her own lost dreams, swallowed nearly to his chest by the treacherous earth. His skin was the color of rich, dark mahogany, a stark contrast to the pale faces of the townsfolk who populated the distant settlement. He was one of them, the savages as they were whispered about in hushed, fearful tones, the people whose territory she trespassed upon with every breath of this wild air. A visceral conflict tore through her. The ingrained fear, the societal mandate to view him as an enemy, battling against the raw, undeniable humanity trapped before her. Her past, a shadowed companion, cautioned her against intervention, reminded her of the cost of misplaced empathy. But the boy's eyes, wide with terror, held a desperate, unadulterated plea that transcended all boundaries. Without a conscious decision, driven by an instinct she thought long buried, Ilara sprang into action. She found a sturdy, fallen branch, thick and gnarled, and extended it tentatively, testing the ground's deceptive solidity. The Quicksand pulled at him with an unseen, monstrous hunger, making every inch of his ascent a desperate battle. She braced herself, her muscles straining, pulling him from the viscous maw, his small, strong hand gripping hers with a fervor that spoke of pure, unadulterated will to live. His body was slick with mud, his breath ragged. When he was finally free, sprawling on the relatively safe ground, he looked at her with an intensity that burned through the fear, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Then, with a sudden, animalistic urgency, he scrambled to his feet and vanished into the dense foliage, leaving her alone, chest heaving, with a chilling realization of what she had just done. The silence that followed was heavier than before, pregnant with consequence. The earth beneath Ilara's knees felt solid, yet the memory of the Quicksand's insidious pull lingered, a phantom sensation against her skin. Her hands, still trembling slightly, were caked with the dark, clinging mud, a physical testament to the impossible choice she had made. The boy was gone, swallowed by the forest as quickly as he had emerged from the mire, leaving her with only the ringing silence and a crushing weight of dread. What had she done? The question echoed in the vast emptiness of her cabin, which now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage of her own making. The societal rules, unspoken but deeply ingrained, screamed at her folly. She had aided an other, crossed an invisible line that delineated their world from hers, and in doing so, had invited an unknown, terrifying future to her doorstep. Her breathing was still ragged, a frantic counterpoint to the quiet solitude of her home. The exhaustion was bone deep, not just from the physical strain of the rescue, but from the immense emotional toll of battling her own ingrained fears and prejudices. She collapsed onto her rough-hewn bench, staring at the flicker of the meager fire, its flames dancing with mocking indifference. The Quicksand was a metaphor, she knew, for the treacherous nature of her own past, a swirling vortex of regret and misplaced trust that had dragged her down before. Her solitary existence here was a penance, a self-imposed exile after the unforgivable sin she had committed, a betrayal that had cost her everything, leaving her brittle and distrustful of the world beyond her property line. She had tried to drown her conscience in this desolate quietude, burying her humanity beneath layers of self-preservation. Yet, the boy's eyes, stark and pleading, had pierced through the hardened shell she had meticulously built. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek, a bitter testament to the resurgence of emotions she had long suppressed. It was a tear not just for the boy, but for herself, for the fragile hope that flickered to life in the aftermath of her impulsive act. She had rescued him, a stranger, a child of a people she had been taught to fear, and in doing so, she had perhaps rescued a piece of herself, a fragment of the compassion she thought was long dead. But at what cost? The silence of the woods now felt predatory. Every rustle of leaves, every distant call of a bird, a potential harbinger of the consequences she so desperately feared. She was an intruder in this ancient land, and her act, however benevolent, might be seen as a challenge, an insult, a reason for retribution. The sun dipped lower, casting long, unsettling shadows that distorted the familiar shapes of her cabin into monstrous forms. She moved mechanically, tending to the few chores that demanded attention, her mind a ceaseless churn of worst-case scenarios. She pictured the boy, telling his story, describing her. Would he speak of gratitude, or of an unwitting intrusion? The image of the quicksand, relentlessly pulling, became a symbol of her own mounting anxiety, dragging her down into a pit of uncertainty. The world outside her window, once a comforting expanse of green and brown, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting. And so did she. The first day after the rescue stretched interminably, each hour a separate, suffocating entity. Elara remained at her cabin, a prisoner of her own fear, the memory of the boy's dark eyes burning into her consciousness. Her mind wrestled with the desperate question, should she tell anyone? The thought of confiding in the townsfolk, their narrow-mindedness and deep-seated prejudices, was as terrifying as the potential retribution from the tribe. They would not understand. They would condemn her, perhaps even accuse her of complicity. No, the burden of this secret would remain hers alone. It was a heavy shroud, weighing down her shoulders, pushing her deeper into the isolation she had once sought but now found unbearable. By mid-afternoon, the dwindling larder forced her hand. She needed supplies, a painful necessity that demanded she venture into the very heart of the judgmental world she had fled. The trip to the nearest settlement, a collection of ramshackle buildings optimistically named Hope's Crossing, was a ritual she dreaded even on the best of days. Today, the journey felt like walking into the lion's den. As she approached, the familiar sounds of distant hammering and human chatter did little to soothe her frayed nerves. The air itself seemed to crackle with an unspoken tension, an undercurrent of fear that was almost palpable. Inside the general store, the usual low hum of conversation felt amplified, every whisper a pointed arrow aimed at her. Old Man Hemlock, his face a roadmap of cynicism, grunted a greeting from behind the counter, his eyes lingering on her muddy boots. "Heard tales, Elara," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "Indians been spotted closer to the river. Too close for comfort." He didn't accuse, not directly, but the implication hung heavy in the stale air. A group of women, their faces pinched with apprehension, clutched their baskets and huddled near the dry goods, their hushed tones carrying, "They say the chief's son, he's gone missing," one whispered, her eyes darting towards Elara, then quickly away. Another chimed in, "Serves him right, those heathens, always causing trouble." Alara's breath hitched in her throat. The news had already reached them. A cold dread seeped into her bones, chilling her to the marrow. The missing boy was her boy, the one she had pulled from the quicksand. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. Her act of pure, human decency, an impulse born of compassion, was now the catalyst for their fear, and potentially her doom. She forced herself to remain calm, to feign indifference, selecting her meager purchases with deliberate slowness. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Each word spoken in the store, each wary glance, was a confirmation of the deep chasm that separated their world from hers, the inherent suspicion that festered beneath the thin veneer of community. She paid for her goods, the coins feeling heavy and insignificant in her palm, and escaped the stifling atmosphere of the store, the whispers following her like a flock of predatory ravens. The walk back to her cabin, usually a peaceful communion with nature, was now an agonizing march towards an uncertain fate. The woods, once a refuge, seemed to conspire against her, every rustle, every shadow, a potential threat. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, but Ilara saw only the encroaching darkness, a metaphor for the gloom descending upon her own life. She closed her cabin door, the solid wood a temporary barrier against the world, but the fear remained, a persistent, gnawing ache in her gut. She was alone, utterly and terrifyingly alone, with a secret that threatened to consume her. The second day arrived, a bleak canvas under a sky that promised no solace. Ilara had barely slept, her mind a relentless churn of anxieties, replaying the rescue, the boy's face, the words overheard in Hope's Crossing. Every snap of a twig outside her cabin, every distant cry of a hawk, sent a jolt of ice through her veins. Paranoia was a creeping vine, winding its tendrils around her heart, squeezing tighter with each passing hour. She cleaned her rifle, an automatic, almost ritualistic action, the cold steel a poor comfort against the overwhelming sense of vulnerability. What would they want? Vengeance? A sacrifice? Or simply information, leading to the confirmation of her impossible, morally ambiguous act? The unknown was a heavier weight than any certainty. The passage of time became an agonizing crawl, each minute amplified, stretching into an eternity. 2 days gone, one more to endure until the dreaded 3-day mark, a period she imagined was significant to them. Perhaps a time for mourning, for planning, for hunting. The repetition of her own thoughts, the cycle of fear and regret, was maddening. She walked the small perimeter of her property, her eyes scanning the tree line, searching for any sign, any movement, any indication of what was to come. The wilderness, usually a source of quiet strength, now felt like a vast, indifferent entity, holding its breath alongside her. A shard of memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced through her present torment. It was a sun-drenched afternoon years ago, a market square vibrant with life, laughter, and the scent of freshly baked bread. Her husband, Thomas, his eyes bright with a future they had meticulously planned. Then the betrayal, swift and devastating, a lie woven with such cunning that it had unraveled their entire existence, leaving her shattered amidst the ruins of their shared dreams. It wasn't a grand, heroic failure, but a quiet, insidious one that had stripped her of her home, her reputation, and ultimately her faith in human connection. She had chosen self-imposed exile, rather than face the pity or condemnation of those who judged without understanding. That past transgression, a quiet sin against her own heart, had hardened her, teaching her that empathy was a luxury, a weakness that could be exploited. This place, this isolation, was her penance, her prison, and her carefully constructed shield. But now, she had breached her own defenses. The rescue of the boy was an act of pure, unadulterated human instinct, a rupture in the wall she had so painstakingly built. Was she foolish? Had her compassionate impulse sealed her fate, or was it a desperate attempt to atone for a past she couldn't outrun? The quicksand, a symbol of sinking and being trapped, was no longer just a physical hazard but a mirror reflecting her own spiritual morass. She had pulled one life from its clutches, yet felt herself sinking deeper into an emotional mire. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and violet, a beautiful, mocking farewell to another day lived in the shadow of impending consequence. The silence of the night that followed was not peaceful, but a heavy, pregnant hush, broken only by the frantic beat of her own anxious heart. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that tomorrow would bring the reckoning. As the false dawn began to bleed across the eastern horizon on the third day, a profound stillness settled over the land. It was the kind of quiet that spoke not of peace, but of anticipation, a held breath before an inevitable storm. Ilara, having not slept a wink, felt it deep in her bones. The air was heavy, charged with an unseen energy, and her senses, honed by years of solitude in the wilderness, picked up subtle cues that screamed of presence. A faint, almost imperceptible displacement of dew on the long grasses near the edge of the woods, a disturbed patch of earth near the stream, too deliberate to be an animal. They were close. Just as the first true rays of sunlight pierced the canopy, a figure emerged from the dense undergrowth, not from the tribe, but from her own world. It was Jebediah, a gaunt, weathered trapper, who occasionally ventured near Hope's Crossing, his face etched with the harshness of the frontier. He held a rusty musket, its barrel glinting ominously in the nascent light. His eyes, sunken and wary, met hers with a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. Fear, suspicion, perhaps a touch of grim satisfaction. "Seen tracks, Alara?" he rasped, his voice low, a conspiratorial hiss. "Injun tracks, moving east towards the river. A whole passel of 'em." He spat, a gesture of contempt. "Heard tell the chief's son went missing. They'll be looking for trouble." Ilara's breath caught. His words were terse, blunt, reflecting the deep-seated fear and animosity that defined their community's relationship with the indigenous people. The subtext was clear. These were savages, and their presence meant only violence. "They'll be seeking peace," she said, the word surprising even herself, a defiant whisper against the tide of his prejudice. She felt a surge of indignation, a fierce protectiveness for the boy she had saved, whose life she had touched. Jebediah snorted, a derisive sound. "Peace? They understand only blood. You're alone out here, woman. If they come, you'll be the first they take." His eyes narrowed, a predatory glint in their depths. Unless you know something. Unless you had a hand in this." The accusation hung in the air, thick and palpable. Alara's heart pounded, but a strange resolve hardened her gaze. She was flawed, yes, burdened by her past, but she was not a betrayer. "I know nothing of their movements, Jebediah. Just trying to live my life, same as you." It was a lie, a thin veil over the truth she carried, but she spoke it with a conviction that seemed to momentarily disarm him. He stared at her for a long moment, a silent battle of wills, before turning his gaze back to the woods, scanning the tree line with a seasoned hunter's eye. The silence that followed was charged, crackling with unspoken tension. The fear of the tribe was one thing, but the fear of her own kind, their judgment and potential retribution, was a more insidious beast. Jebediah eventually grunted, a sound of frustrated resignation, and melted back into the shadows from which he had emerged, leaving Alara once again alone, but not truly. His presence, his suspicion, had solidified her understanding of the stakes. The world was closing in, and her past, her present, and her terrifying future were converging at her secluded cabin. The inevitability of the tribe's arrival was no longer a distant dread but a palpable force, pressing down on her from every direction. The sun was now fully risen, illuminating the forest, revealing nothing yet everything. The curtain was about to rise, and she, the unwitting protagonist, stood on the precipice of a fate she could not escape. The morning of the third day settled around Alara like a shroud, heavy and oppressive. The confrontation with Jebediah had only sharpened the edges of her dread, clarifying the perilous position she occupied. She was caught between two worlds, distrusted by her own, and awaiting the unknown intentions of the other. The very air hummed with a tension that resonated with her own frantic pulse. She moved through her cabin, a ghost in her own home, performing tasks with a grim, practiced efficiency. The old musket, recently cleaned, lay on the worn wooden table, a stark, unwelcome presence. She knew, deep down, that it offered little real protection against an entire tribe, but its familiar weight in her hands was a cold, small comfort against the vastness of her fear. She stoked the embers in the hearth, watching the smoke curl upwards, a thin, ephemeral ribbon against the stoic wood of the chimney. What would happen? The question was a relentless drumbeat in her mind, echoing the frantic thrumming of her own heart. Would they come with war paint and weapons, demanding retribution for a perceived trespass? Or would they simply demand the boy back, revealing her act to her fearful neighbors, thus condemning her to the very judgment she had fled? Her past, a constant, nagging companion, whispered of consequences, of the irreversible nature of certain choices. She had chosen to save a life, an act that felt profoundly right in the moment. Yet it was an act that now threatened to unravel the carefully constructed solitude she had built around herself. She had always sought to disappear, to become invisible, and now she was about to be seen, perhaps more clearly than she had ever been. A sense of fatalism began to settle over her, a strange, weary acceptance of her impending fate. She had lived her life in the shadows, burdened by a secret shame, and perhaps this was the reckoning, the inevitable culmination of a life lived on the fringes. She had pulled a life from the quicksand, only to feel herself being slowly consumed by the relentless march of consequences. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. She stood by her window, looking out at the familiar expanse of trees that had once offered her sanctuary, now feeling like a looming wall. The early morning light filtered through the leaves, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns of gold and shadow. It was a beautiful, serene world, utterly indifferent to the turmoil raging within her. Then, a sound. Not a twig snapping, not a bird's call, but a rhythmic thud, deep and resonant, vibrating through the earth itself. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, a distant drumbeat, then another, closer, followed by the soft rustle of many bodies moving through the undergrowth. Her breath caught in her throat, her blood ran cold. The silence that had held the morning captive fractured, replaced by the subtle, growing hum of an approaching force. She could see them now, not clearly, but as dark, shifting forms through the dense foliage, a silent, formidable wave approaching her secluded home. The chief's son, the boy she had saved, was among them. The world seemed to hold its breath. The moment of reckoning had arrived. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not just with fear, but with a strange, defiant pulse that acknowledged the enormity of the moment. The approaching presence was no longer a distant hum but a palpable force, radiating a raw, untamed energy that thrummed through the very ground Alara stood on. Her cabin, once a symbol of her solitude, now felt like a fragile shell, utterly exposed to the sheer, overwhelming power bearing down upon it. She watched from her window, a silent, unblinking sentinel, as the forest parted, not in a chaotic rush, but with a deliberate, disciplined grace. They emerged, a wave of dark figures, their faces stoic, adorned with paint that spoke of ancient traditions and a profound connection to the land. They were more numerous than she could have possibly imagined. Dozens, perhaps scores, their movements fluid and coordinated, a stark contrast to the rough, haphazard gait of the frontiersmen she knew. At the forefront, commanding attention without uttering a single word, stood a man of imposing stature. He was undeniably the chief. His bearing regal, his eyes dark and unyielding, seemed to pierce through the very wood of her cabin, fixing on her with an intensity that stole her breath. Beside him, slightly behind, was the boy, the same boy she had pulled from the quicksand, miraculously clean of mud now, his gaze, like his father's, unwavering, yet holding a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. There was no immediate aggression, no war cries, no brandished weapons in a hostile manner. Just this profound, heavy silence, broken only by the rustle of their movements and the beating of Alara's own frantic heart. They fanned out, forming a semicircle around her cabin, their silent presence an undeniable statement of power and intent. Each face was a study in impassivity, yet Alara felt the weight of their collective gaze, 1,000 unspoken questions and judgments. Her initial terror began to intertwine with a strange sense of awe, a grudging respect for their composure, their unified strength. She was but one woman, frail and alone, against the formidable tide of their collective will. The air crackled with unspoken meaning. Every movement, every subtle shift of weight, seemed charged with significance. The chief's eyes, ancient and wise, held hers, a silent, unwavering gaze that seemed to probe the depths of her soul, searching for answers she herself did not fully possess. The silence stretched, taut and agonizing, broken only by the distant caw of a crow, a stark reminder of the wild world they all inhabited. Alara's breath hitched, her lungs burning for air she couldn't quite draw. She wanted to speak, to explain, to plead, but no words would form. Her throat was constricted, her tongue heavy. All she could do was stand there, utterly exposed, facing the consequences of her rash, compassionate act. The young boy stepped forward, just a pace, his eyes still fixed on her, and for a fleeting moment she thought she saw a flicker of something familiar, a recognition. It was a small, fragile spark in the vast sea of her fear, but it was there. This was not the chaotic, vengeful horde she had imagined, but something far more complex, far more unsettling in its quiet intensity. The true nature of their visit, the mystery of their intent, hung heavy in the air, a suspenseful promise waiting to be revealed. The chief broke the silence, his voice a low rumble, rich and resonant, yet utterly devoid of aggression. It was a sound that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath them. He spoke in a language Alara did not understand, a rhythmic flow of guttural sounds and sharp consonants, but his gaze remained fixed on her, unwavering, as if he expected her to comprehend the intent behind his words, even if the meaning escaped her. He gestured, a slow, deliberate movement of his hand, towards the young boy. The boy, in turn, stepped fully into the clearing, his eyes meeting Alara's again, and this time the flicker was undeniable. It was gratitude, profound and clear, shining in his dark gaze. Then, the boy spoke. His voice, though still young, carried a weight beyond his years. He spoke not in his native tongue, but in a fractured, halting version of her own language, a language clearly learned from snippets, from trade, from observation. She, pull, mud, life. Each word was a struggle, a deliberate effort, but the message was stark, undeniable. He pointed at Alara, then made a pulling motion with his hands, mimicking the struggle of escaping the quicksand. He touched his chest, then swept his hand outwards, indicating the life she had given back to him. The chief watched him, his impassive face betraying nothing, but Alara felt a tremor pass through the collective silence of the tribe. A wave of bewildered understanding washed over Alara, slowly displacing the icy grip of fear. This was not vengeance. This was something else entirely. Her initial terror, a primal reaction to the unknown, began to dissolve into a dawning realization. He hadn't returned to punish her, but to bear witness, to confirm, perhaps even to offer something in return. The mystery of their return began to unravel, exposing a truth far more profound than she had ever dared to imagine. Her act of reckless compassion, born of pure instinct, was being acknowledged, understood, valued. The chief then spoke again, this time pointing to the boy, then to Alara, then making a gesture that encompassed his entire tribe. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces of his people, then back to Alara. Another word, this time spoken with clarity in the colonist's tongue, resonated through the clearing. Debt. The word hung in the air, heavy with significance. It was not a threat, but a statement of principle, a deep cultural obligation. The irony was palpable, sharp, and cutting. The townsfolk, steeped in their prejudices, would have expected only savagery, only violence. Yet, here stood a chief, a leader of a people they so readily demonized, speaking of debt, of honor, of a sacred bond forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. Alara felt her knees weaken, not from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming release of tension. The truth, stark and undeniable, washed over her. They had come for her, yes, but not to harm. They had come because she had saved one of their own, and in their world, such an act demanded recognition, a balancing of scales. The stereotypes of the savage fell away, leaving behind a complex, dignified people whose values were, perhaps clearer, more absolute, than those of her own fragmented society. She stood there, a solitary figure against the backdrop of their silent, formidable presence, her past sins momentarily fading against the stark clarity of this present truth. The revelation was not just about them, but about herself, about the unexpected ripple effect of a single, human act of mercy. The air, once thick with unspoken menace, now hummed with a different kind of energy, one of profound, almost sacred, understanding. The chief stepped forward, his movements deliberate, his gaze still fixed on Alara. He lifted his hand, not in aggression, but in a gesture of profound meaning. In his palm rested a finely carved wooden figure, a small, intricate representation of a hunting hawk, its wings spread as if in flight. It was a piece of exquisite craftsmanship, imbued with a quiet power. He extended it towards her, a silent offering, a tangible symbol of the debt he had spoken of. This was the pivotal emotional climax, the moment where the cascading fears and anxieties of the past 3 days converged into a singular, overwhelming wave of relief and profound connection. Ilara reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she accepted the carving. The wood was smooth, warm from his touch, and the craftsmanship spoke of hours of patient dedication, a stark contrast to the hasty, often crude items of her own people. Her fingers closed around it, and in that simple act, a dam broke within her. The tears came unbidden, hot and stinging, tracing paths through the dust and grime on her cheeks. They were not tears of fear, but of an overwhelming, soul-deep release. Relief, certainly, that her life was not forfeit, but more than that, a profound emotional catharsis. The burden of her past, the shame that had driven her into this self-imposed exile, felt momentarily lighter, as if this unexpected act of reciprocal grace had lifted a corner of the heavy shroud she had carried for so long. The chief watched her, his expression softening almost imperceptibly, acknowledging her raw emotion without judgment. The tribe, too, remained silent, their presence no longer a threat, but a witness to this quiet, transformative exchange. For years, Ilara had lived with the weight of her own moral ambiguity, the quiet despair of a flawed existence, a sense of having irrevocably broken something within herself. Her act of saving the boy had been an impulsive leap of faith, a desperate reach for something pure, and now it was being mirrored back to her, amplified and dignified by a people she had been taught to fear. This gesture, this simple carving, was more than just a token. It was an affirmation of her humanity, a recognition of the good she had performed, despite the fractured pieces of her own soul. The dark, tense tone that had pervaded her days gave way to a fragile, nascent hope. Hope for herself, that redemption, however quiet, was possible. Hope for a different kind of understanding, one that transcended the ingrained prejudices of her society. The irony was sharp. The savages had shown her more grace, more honor than her own kind often did. Her isolated world, once a prison, now seemed infused with a new possibility, a new sense of belonging that stretched beyond the narrow confines of Hope's Crossing. The quicksand, that symbol of entrapment, now seemed less ominous, having yielded a life and, unexpectedly, a profound gift of connection. The chief gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of completion, a silent acknowledgement that the debt was paid, the understanding forged. The air began to breathe again, not with tension, but with the quiet promise of a future yet unwritten. The chief, with another silent gesture, turned. His tribe began to move, melting back into the dense embrace of the forest with the same disciplined quietude with which they had arrived. The young boy, the rescued son, cast one final lingering look back at Ilara, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a shared secret woven into the fabric of their lives. Then he too vanished, leaving Ilara standing alone in the clearing, the hand-carved hawk warm and smooth in her palm, the only tangible proof of the extraordinary events that had just transpired. The silence that settled in their wake was not the oppressive, fearful quiet of the past days, but a vast, expectant hush, pregnant with new meaning. Her cabin, her sanctuary, now felt different. The air within it seemed lighter, infused with a subtle resonance that hadn't been there before. Ilara walked inside, her steps unhurried, almost reverent. She placed the hawk on her small, rough table, its presence radiating a quiet strength. It was more than just a carving. It was a symbol, a testament to the fact that compassion, however fraught with risk, could pierce through the deepest divides, could bridge chasms of fear and prejudice. Her perspective on her own life, once viewed through the cynical lens of past hurts and self-imposed isolation, had irrevocably shifted. She was no longer just the woman who had fled, but the woman who had chosen humanity, who had acted against the tide of societal expectation and found an unexpected, profound reward. The impact of the chief's visit, though unwitnessed by the fearful townsfolk, was nevertheless transformative. It wasn't a public redemption, but a deeply personal one, a quiet unburdening of a soul that had long carried the weight of its own perceived failures. The dark clouds that had shadowed her inner world for so long now held pockets of light, shafts of hope that promised a way forward. The quicksand, once a fearsome maw of destruction, had become a paradoxical crucible for unexpected grace. It had nearly claimed a life, but in yielding it, had brought two disparate worlds into a fragile, hopeful alignment. Alara continued her solitary existence, but it was no longer an exile. It was a choice, imbued with a new sense of purpose. She watched the seasons turn, the leaves bud and fall, the river freeze and thaw. The woods, her ever-present companion, now whispered not of fear, but of ancient knowledge, of interconnectedness. She never spoke of the visit to anyone in Hope's Crossing, knowing their ingrained biases would never allow them to comprehend the truth of it. But sometimes, when the wind was just right, carrying the scent of pine and distant campfires, she would trace the smooth lines of the hawk carving, remembering the dark, wise eyes of the chief and the grateful gaze of his son. She knew, with a quiet certainty, that her act had forged a delicate, unseen bridge, a silent understanding between her isolated world and theirs. The future remained uncertain, always, but for the first time in a long time, Alara faced it with a fragile, yet enduring sense of hope, knowing that even in the deepest darkness, an act of human kindness could spark a light that refused to be extinguished. The story of the woman who saved a chief's son from quicksand was not just a tale of survival, but a quiet testament to the enduring power of compassion in a world too often consumed by fear